Hey everyone. After hearing all the talks and all the questions today, I figured that this talk should probably be about habitat creation, management, landowner outreach, natural lands projects, and how that leads to bobwhite conservation. But that's kind of a crazy, title. But what I'm going to focus on those three things, and I'm going to do that through our work at the River and Field campus and how our efforts there have led to one of the largest quail populations in the state, and then how those efforts have motivated, inspired, and sort of formed the basis for the Natural Lands Project, and which I'll talk to a little bit later. So this is the River and Field campus, locally known as Chino Farms. It's a large property, 5,000 acres, but we are not managing 5,000 acres of quail habitat. It's a working farm. Our efforts are mostly focused up here north of 544. That's mostly what I'm going to talk about. The large area up the top is our grasslands, and then another area I'll talk a little bit about too, and how our efforts there are really, kind of forming the basis of where all our quail are hanging out. And so here's a plane photo, kind of several years ago before drones started getting, highly used. Surrounding landscapes, pretty typical Eastern Shore, row crop farming, some small wood lots, usually a lot of river around, but that middle section is really what is the distinguishing factor. 220 acres planted in the program Sandy was talking about back in '99. Native warm season grasses was done in an experimental design with the replicate plantings, different mixes planted across the site, and the idea was to evaluate how those would do and then what the wildlife response would be to those practices. Here's a more recent shot from last summer, looking pretty lush. The Chester River is right there, and where we are is just about 3 miles upriver or so. This was the fall, this past fall, right after we did one of our fall burns. As you can see, we've got the site pretty blocked off in sort of a patchwork, and I'll talk a little bit about our management challenges really on what we're trying to accomplish out there. Now, keep in mind, this was planted in '99. When sort of there wasn't a lot known about native grasses in this area. And so we planted the tall grasses, switchgrass, big blue stem, which we all know now invade and take over. And so that's what some of our challenges have been, is how to control those species and maintain plant biodiversity, which is very different from the projects we're putting in now, where you're not necessarily managing what you plant, it's what comes in. So those woody species we've heard about, and the noxious weeds, where we're in a different boat because we have these grasses, we have 23 years of seed production. We're always going to be managing what we planted. So it's a little bit harder. We do this with fire, disking, and some herbicide, and I still leave grazing up there because one of these days we're going to try and get some cattle out there and do some rotational grazing, but that's still a little ways away. So this is our burn plan we submit for this part of the farm. The red outlines were actually the original fields that were planted in '99. In 2011, we broke those larger fields up into these smaller blocks. So the green is what we burned in the fall, this past fall, and then the pink is what we aim to have burned this spring. As Clay said, we don't get to do everything like we always wanted to do. In that long field up against the river there, we've been trying to burn that for 2 years now. It's going on about 5 years since it's actually been burned. And for those of you that come out on the field trip later, you'll see it's pretty woody, but that's what we do. So we like to burn every 2 years. So each of these blocks gets burned every 2 years, and we rotate around. And what happens is the unburned blocks are where the quail will nest and then take their broods into the burned blocks where there's no thatch, and they can maneuver underneath the ground underneath the vegetation relatively easily. Some of the results from doing the different burns across the different seasons is how the grass reacts. So the native grasses really respond to the spring burns. They really fill in, they take advantage of that open ground. It's black, it warms up. They get up a lot faster than the wildflowers. And so this is percent cover across those fields. Whereas the fall burns, some of the wildflowers and overwintering forbs kind of do pretty well in that environment. So that's important for quail, right, in terms of what they're eating, and later in the spring. But the fall burns don't do as well. Now, by the end of the growing season, those fields are pretty much, if you just looked at them, they're going to be about the same in terms of visual, but the early growing season is different.
And real quick, just for acceptance of general knowledge, define the dates that are usually used for the fall burn versus the spring burn.
We try burn mid-October to mid-November for the fall burn, so it's pretty late in the season. And then in the spring, we're going from usually March 1st to April 15th. So that we have that April 15th cutoff date because of this is enrolled ground. We don't do any summer burning. That probably would help a lot with some of our woody species, but obviously we don't want to be burning up nesting wildlife. We did a disking experiment where 2 of these original fields that were paired replicates, we broke into thirds, a deep disc or a normal disc, which was about 6 to 8 inches deep, and then a light disc, which was about 2 to 4 inches across those fields. So vegetation measurements, and this is what we got. So the normal deeper disc produced a lot more bare ground, which was just mentioned, important for quail. Definitely hurt the grasses, the native grasses. The fork component throughout those 3 plots didn't really change that much, but the bare ground and the cover of the grasses really was different. So not a huge difference, I would say, between the light and normal disc, but the idea is to reduce those thick grasses, big blue switchgrass that I know we're not planting now, but for some of those areas, I think at Clay's place there, they still have some of those thicker grasses from some of those plantings way back when. So disking is an important and valuable option for people. I will say, however, what ends up happening is you disc up those native grass clumps into many smaller native grass clumps, which eventually become bigger clumps. So this is something you can't just do once and walk away. It would probably be something you'd have to do on a 3-year basis to kind of maintain that amount of bare ground. And then lastly, we've been doing some experiments with doing some strip spraying. This is a photo taken a year after or 2 years after it was originally sprayed. And so what we did was take off every other nozzle on the boom sprayer. After the burn, we waited for the grasses to get up about a foot, came through with just Roundup and knocked back those grasses. This was obviously after a burn. We only sprayed 1 time, and this started in 2016. So keep that in mind, in 2016. 2 years after a burn, after it was originally sprayed, that's what it looked like right after a burn. Later that summer, as we mentioned, the warm season grasses really respond to those spring burns. They came up, but you can clearly see the lanes where that was sprayed. And then this is late summer, so black-eyed Susan filled in, and there's so that was done 1 time in 2016, and we can still see the effects this spring like that. So that's another important aspect to think about whenever you're talking about management, is it has consequences, and some of them are not very long and others are lasting. So always think about those kind of managements. So the idea was to experiment this. We've done vegetation measurements on it with the goal of, once we get some of our other weed issues on these grasslands taken care of, we're going to do this across more of the fields to open up more of the ground, create that bare ground, more flower diversity, and thin out the monocultures of our taller grasses. We do all this work for these guys, right? So this is a survey started in 2009 by Bob Long. Point counts across the property, both in the summer, which are the blue bars, and in the fall for cubby counts in the red. Clay mentioned 2010 snowstorms. Luckily, perfect timing. We got a count in the fall of 09, and we recorded 35 coveys on the property. Now, I should say we've been monitoring quail on the property for quite some time, many decades prior to this, but none of those surveys were actually consistent across all those different years, so it's kind of hard to compare the numbers. But these surveys have been done consistent to 2009, following those same protocols. 35 coveys in 09, snowstorms in February of 2010 dropped them to 3. Unfortunately, we didn't have summer counts in 09, but you kind of can imagine what they would have been like way up there. So fast forward to 2015 here, we're back up to where we were pre-storm levels. So that's super encouraging, right? And if you put that into the perspective of, say, the rest of the Eastern Shore, I would say we're probably here, right? Except for some of these properties where we've heard from today that have some quail, a lot of these places have 0 to a few birds hanging on. But if we put in habitat and manage it, look where we can end up. So I think it's really positive, a positive story. Now, you may notice on the summer counts for the last 4 years, we've been declining the number of males that we're hearing over the summertime, but the coveys have remained stable.
And the rebound in the numbers from the snowstorms, is that no additional translocations?
We did 1 translocation the first year that you did it, Bill, but through radio tracking, we could tell that only 2 birds survived to actually nest that first year, and that was done here. So it supplemented it a little bit, but overall, the impact of releasing those 20 birds is pretty minimal based on their survivorship. But lower numbers for summer calling males, and I did a count last week, and I had 23 males. So still a nice number, and we hear birds all the time, but it's not where we want to be. And so the story of that is our winter cover is affecting how many birds are making it through the winter, right? So, but we have a ton of nesting habitat. So the population gets up, our fall recruitment numbers are good, number of birds going into the winter is really, pretty stable, but each winter they're getting nailed, and that's declining. So we're kind of doing this with our population, and if we can increase winter survivorship, then I think we could, get that number up a lot higher.
What are you missing out in winter survivorship?
More hedgerows, more shrub islands, just winter blackberry thickets, those kinds of things that birds can, get cover in, rather than just random trees and shrubs kind of everywhere. And actually, this is one of the efforts to increase some winter cover across the farm. This is on another portion of the farm called the East Farm. The grasslands are kind of up and left out of the picture. This area's had cover for a long time with corners taken out of production. The field kind of goes this way with a buffer. The northern end has cover. But what is different and unique, and I don't think you'll find this anywhere else on the shore at least, is we took out irrigated land and put in habitat through the middle. So this is where the irrigation hits, same with up north, and then 200-foot strips through the middle. And this has been really, really productive. So birds now have corridors to move across the farm, and this is particularly important, after harvest. But tons of nesting habitat, and they like to be away during the summer months, away from any of the woody edges where some of those predators are concentrated, right? And we just basically, out of a 140-acre field or so, we took out 8 acres of production to do this. And the reason why we did it under irrigation is because we were trying to plant native woody shrubs. This is really sandy ground in this area. They were not surviving. And so we put it under irrigation, and now we have winter cover underneath those for when they were naturally irrigated, the fields.
On this side, was that originally hay?
No, it's all row crop.
Okay.
Yeah. And these are the numbers from one of those point counts taken on the northern end, which does not actually, I can't hear this side here. So you can see that dip in number of calling males I'm hearing from that location. So after the snowstorms, we kind of lost any birds who were there. As birds started producing, probably out in the grasslands, it started moving over and we started hearing birds here. So you don't have to have 228 acres of continuous native grasslands to make a difference for quail. And so that's the idea. Bob mentioned pathways or corridors connecting habitat. So, you know, this could be a couple different farms. We're just fortunate enough to have it on one here. And so all of that work, that success, like I said, started the Natural Lands Project in 2015. And the idea was to take what we knew and get off the farm and start working with other landowners to kind of make a difference and, you know, get some habitat on the ground for quail else outside of the farm boundaries. It's all grant funded through water quality improvement money from DNR and National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We're just doing it in a way that appeals to landowners, and that's like that habitat on the ground, so they can actually see the difference. It's hard to really quantify putting in a buffer and how much water quality actually improves. You're not going to go look and see like, oh, now I have clean water after a year, but you can plant it and get immediately responses from the habitat. In terms of pollinators, grassland birds, quail obviously take a little bit longer to find some of these things. But since 2015, we've planted over 1,500 acres of habitat. Some of that is in wetlands and some forested areas, but at least 1,200 acres of that is in grassland, meadows, buffers, and things like that, that early successional habitat requires. And we're doing a lot of work on some non-WMAs, county lands, state park lands with some good success. So the one I want to highlight today is Conquest Preserve, which is a public land, Queen Anne's County public land just west of Centerville. There's about 300 or so acres of grassland habitat out here right now, and we developed it with trails in mind for public access. We planted about 40 acres of trees to fill in that forested block for the forest interior dwelling species. We restored 5 out of those 8 wetlands. So we have wetlands in the middle of the fields, transitions to wet meadows, then to upland habitat. And then the fields are just labeled. So when birders go there and they see a cool bird, they can say, hey, go to field 5, so-and-so is there, you know. So this has been really cool. This was planted in 2018, but we started monitoring quail or listening for quail up and down this road since 2015. So we have several years of data prior to actually this getting put into habitat. And I will say this county property did have buffers on it already and everything like that. So it wasn't like it went from edge to edge to all habitat. But for the first few years, we were hearing no quail, and then we heard one quail, one male calling, and there is some habitat up the road a little ways. And then 2 years ago, we heard 2 birds, and then this past summer, we heard 6 birds. So you kind of get the idea there. You're starting to see that trajectory go up as the habitat matures. And so this still lacks the woody cover component, but we're planting cedar trees and other hedgerows. There's a bunch of imagery that just shows what the property looks like sort of from the wetlands that we put in, but you can see all around it and kind of get a sense of the scale of the grasslands that are around. That's the Corsica River. Corsica flowing out to the Chester River there in the winter shot there. That's old broom sedge that you're seeing, that nice orange grass that's super important for quail. And then here's just a ton of eye candy photos of some of our project sites. So 100-foot buffer on the Choptank River there. So very different from the old plantings, which are dominated by grass. We're putting in a ton of wildflowers, quail in an early bean field. Another 100-foot buffer on the Chester River there. Wetlands. Grasshopper sparrow, we've seen that earlier. And this is Bob's place right here. You heard from Bob earlier. We took 50 odd acres out of and put it into habitat. We put hedgerows, put in that wetland, it's, while we haven't had quail show up yet, it's been really, really great for all sorts of wildlife. And I kind of regret actually putting this slide in because I had another series of slides that actually that showed Bob's place in relation to neighboring properties, and then something we're calling the anchor farm approach. And that was, I think the guy from Calvert County asked about how to get quail to places, and it all comes down to habitat, right? So one property alone, or most of the time, one property alone is not going to be able to do it all by themselves. It's going to take neighboring properties, right? And so in 2018, we planted 50 acres of habitat on this property here in the former buffers. It went essentially from 0 habitat to 50 acres. And then in 2019, did 25 up in that section. And then 2020, another 15 over there. The blue sections are 2 landowners that have had quail or early successional habitat for quite some time, and they deserve a lot of credit managing that. But here you can see the approach. So Bob mentioned when we first spoke, he brought his neighbors right away and started talking to them about how to make a bigger difference across the larger landscape. And so that's what we're trying to do, is connect with neighbors. And so we're actually talking with a neighbor that lives right here that has the ability to put in some substantial amount of habitat. And there's actually some habitat further up that way that I didn't map. But this is how we make a difference. And the reason why I put this one up today to kind of demonstrate the anchor farm approach is in 2020, I flushed a pair of birds here and talking with the landowners, and this is kind of the same story. They had not seen or heard quail in decades. So I don't know where they came from. It's probably from the efforts of the 2 landowners that are in blue. And in 2021, I flushed a female off of that new habitat up on the top. And then the reason why I put this in is because on Friday, that landowner called me and said that she flushed a hen and 7 young quail. And so that's our first positive or confirmation that quail are nesting and being successful on our project site. So we've had 8 other properties where quail have shown up that were probably on the landscape. No one knew about them, but they're shown up, and then this is our first confirmation of birds nesting away from, you know, Chino and on these new natural lands project properties. So obviously really excited about that. So birds will find the projects, not all of them right away, and maybe never, depending on the landscape context, but I do think there's more quail out on the landscape than we know, and this is a similar slide that Bob had earlier showing eBird data. This is specifically from 2005 to 10. The blue dots are just locations of where birders have heard or seen quail. I don't know any numbers without clicking on each one of those dots, but that's kind of the spread of birds that we're seeing in 2005 to 2010. Jump another 5 years, and it doesn't actually change a whole lot, right? There's a little bit fewer birds down on the lower shore in Worcester County. It looks like Blackwater is kind of picking up a little bit, which is here. Delaware looks like it's increasing a little bit, and then where we are in this area, getting a few more sightings, right? And then this is 2015 to 2021. Lower shore still doesn't have as many birds reported, but Blackwater is definitely picking up. There's a fewer birds in Delaware, but definitely more birds out in this way. And so to put this in context, this is just birders going out birding and hearing birds, right? They don't have access to a lot of properties, obviously. So this is from the road, could be some public lands, but basically it's like the minimum number of birds that are probably on the landscape that, you know, we know about. So there's more birds on the landscape than we know about for sure. And the things that in common that I'm seeing where we've had birds show up on these new project sites are there's existing hedgerows on the landscape. So they're probably just been squeaking by with that winter cover, but there's no nesting habitat for them to build that population up. So to make a difference, the only way to, you know, get quail back up to any kind of good numbers is to put habitat on the ground, nesting habitat. And if there's no winter habitat in the area, you have to incorporate that as well. So don't be discouraged if you don't get quail right away, but because we're definitely seeing examples of other areas that are getting birds. And that's it. So hopefully I left you with a real positive message. I did want to just say one thing. John and Tom and Clay talked about all the effort that they're doing for quail on their properties, but I just want everyone else to know who maybe be able to do like 20, 30, 40 acres or even less, that these guys are managing a ton of ground. So don't be intimidated by the amount of effort that they're doing, because obviously the amount of hours and effort to manage 20, 30, 40 acres is a lot different than what Clay's doing across 700 acres. So stay positive and don't get too discouraged.